Vietnam, a country whose history is deeply rooted in conflict and resilience. While much of the world knows of its turbulent past, the story of North Vietnam, its rise to power, and the dark legacies that still echo through time, is often overshadowed by the broader scope of the Vietnam War. To truly understand the struggles of a divided nation and the toll of a decades-long war, we must first take a closer look at the rise of North Vietnam, the political machinations that shaped it, and the human cost of its dark history. For nearly a century, Vietnam was a pawn in a game of global powers. Colonized by the French, torn apart by war, and driven by a powerful communist ideology, North Vietnam played a pivotal role in shaping the modern world's understanding of freedom, oppression, and revolution. But behind the struggle for independence and the fight against the imperialists lay a history fraught with suffering, repression, and the heavy hand of political violence. In the late 19th century, Vietnam became part of French Indochina. The French, seeking to expand their empire in Southeast Asia, imposed a colonial system that exploited the land and the people. The Vietnamese were subjected to harsh labor conditions, with much of their land used for French agricultural ventures. Their resources, wealth, and culture were systematically drained, as France built its own colonial empire on the backs of its subjects. For the majority of the Vietnamese people, life under French rule was marked by poverty, injustice, and cultural suppression. The French sought to reshape Vietnam, installing their own system of education, language, and governance. The Vietnamese, however, did not bow easily to foreign rule. In the rural regions, the seeds of rebellion began to grow, leading to the rise of anti-colonial movements across the country. One of the most significant movements to rise in opposition to French colonialism was the Viet Minh, a nationalist and communist resistance organization led by none other than Ho Chi Minh. Ho, who had spent years abroad studying socialist thought and working with international communist movements, became the face of Vietnam's fight for independence. By the 1930s, the desire for independence from French rule had grown into a powerful nationalist movement, and one figure emerged at the forefront of this revolution: Ho Chi Minh. Born Nguyen Sinh Cung, Ho's early life in Vietnam exposed him to the widespread inequality and exploitation suffered by the Vietnamese under French colonial rule. But it wasn't just Vietnam's plight that motivated him. Ho had a broader vision of socialist revolution. After spending time in Europe, the Soviet Union, and China, Ho became deeply committed to Marxist-Leninist ideology. In 1941, after years of working within various resistance groups, Ho Chi Minh returned to Vietnam and formed the Viet Minh, a coalition of communist and nationalist groups united by the goal of independence from French rule. Their struggle would not only be against the French, but also against any foreign influence that threatened the country's sovereignty. World War II shifted the global balance of power, and by 1940, Japan occupied French Indochina. The French colonial administration was effectively neutralized, and the Viet Minh saw an opportunity. They waged guerrilla warfare against both Japanese forces and the French colonial authorities, who were trying to regain control after Japan's defeat. During the Japanese occupation, the Viet Minh began to gain significant traction among the people. Ho Chi Minh, now their undisputed leader, became the symbol of resistance and independence. The resistance movement grew, and the Viet Minh's popularity spread, laying the groundwork for what would become the First Indochina War. In 1945, Japan's defeat marked a turning point for Vietnam. The French, eager to reassert control over their colonies, returned to Vietnam. But the Viet Minh, now well organized and battle-hardened, were not about to relinquish their hard-fought gains. The French and the Viet Minh began a brutal, full-scale conflict, known as the First Indochina War. The French, relying on traditional military power, found themselves bogged down in the dense jungles of Vietnam. The Viet Minh, employing guerrilla tactics, waged a campaign of attrition against their colonial oppressors. In 1954, the war reached its climax with the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, a decisive confrontation between the Viet Minh and the French. The French, expecting a quick victory, were instead overwhelmed by the ingenuity and determination of the Viet Minh. In a stunning victory, the Viet Minh forced the French to surrender, effectively ending French colonial rule in Vietnam. The Geneva Accords of 1954 officially divided Vietnam into two parts: the Communist North, led by Ho Chi Minh, and the anti-communist South, under the leadership of President Ngo Dinh Diem. The division was intended to be temporary, with elections planned for 1956 to reunify the country. However, the political and ideological chasm between the two regions would only grow deeper, setting the stage for the Vietnam War. With the division of Vietnam in 1954, the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, North Vietnam, was established with Ho Chi Minh as its president. Under his leadership, North Vietnam began to shape its future along communist lines, influenced heavily by the Soviet Union and China. In the North, the new government faced an immense challenge. They inherited a country ravaged by years of colonialism, war, and poverty. The leadership sought to rebuild and reshape society based on socialist principles. However, this transformation came at a steep cost, particularly for those who resisted the new regime. One of the most significant aspects of the North Vietnamese government was the central role of the Communist Party. While Ho Chi Minh remained the face of the revolution, the true power lay with the Communist Party, which often ruled with an iron fist. The party's grip on power was enforced through harsh repression, surveillance, and purges of suspected political opponents. In the early years of North Vietnam's existence, the government embarked on a bold and brutal land reform policy. The goal was to redistribute land from the wealthy landlords to the poor peasants, but the methods used were horrific. From 1953 to 1956, the government carried out a series of purges targeting landowners and anyone suspected of being a reactionary. Thousands were accused of being class enemies and were subjected to public humiliation, imprisonment, and in many cases, execution. It's estimated that between 50,000 and 100,000 people were killed during this campaign. The land reform policy wreaked havoc on the rural population, sowing fear and division among the peasants. While the government claimed to be advancing the cause of social justice, the brutal repression left lasting scars on the people, many of whom would never fully recover from the violence and trauma. As the 1950s progressed, tensions between North and South Vietnam began to escalate. The 1954 Geneva Accords had promised elections to reunify the country, but those elections never took place. Instead, the division deepened, and by 1955, the United States had begun to take an increasingly active role in supporting the anti-communist South under President Ngo Dinh Diem. Diem's government was deeply unpopular in South Vietnam, but it received significant support from the US government, which feared the spread of communism in Southeast Asia, a fear that became known as the domino theory. North Vietnam, under Ho Chi Minh, saw itself as the rightful government of all of Vietnam, and the country's political and ideological division soon morphed into a full-scale military conflict. The Vietnam War, also known as the Second Indochina War, officially began in the early 1960s, but by the mid-1960s, US forces were heavily involved. The North, supported by the Soviet Union and China, waged a protracted war of attrition against the South and its American allies. Meanwhile, the US bombed the North relentlessly, attempting to break the will of the North Vietnamese government and its military. The war devastated the Vietnamese people, both in the North and the South. While the North's commitment to the war was unwavering, it came at a tremendous cost. The US bombing campaigns, coupled with the North's own military tactics, resulted in the deaths of millions of civilians and soldiers. As the war dragged on, the devastation was not limited to the battlefield. Entire villages were destroyed, families displaced, and countless lives lost. While the Vietnam War is often remembered for its massive scale and the heavy toll it took on both the US and Vietnam, a darker side of the conflict remains. Within North Vietnam, the war was used as a justification for even more brutal political purges and the use of re-education camps, where anyone suspected of disloyalty or collaboration with the South was detained. After the war, especially in the years leading up to and following the fall of Saigon in 1975, thousands of individuals who were accused of collaborating with the South or of being enemies of the state were sent to these camps. The conditions were harsh. Prisoners were forced to perform labor, subjected to ideological indoctrination, and many were starved or beaten. The true scale of the atrocities in these camps is still not fully known. The war also pushed the North Vietnamese government to take extreme measures in the name of victory. Political dissent was silenced, free speech was suppressed, and the government's power to control the population expanded. There was little room for debate about the course of the war or the ideology of the government. The war finally ended in 1975 with the fall of Saigon, the capital of South Vietnam, to the North Vietnamese forces. The country was reunified under communist rule, and the Democratic Republic of Vietnam became the Socialist Republic of Vietnam. While the victory was celebrated by the North, the aftermath of the war left the nation deeply scarred. In the years following reunification, North Vietnam's communist government faced the monumental task of rebuilding a country that had been devastated by war. The infrastructure was in ruins, the economy was shattered, and millions of people were left traumatized by the years of conflict. But beyond the physical rebuilding, there was also the matter of the psychological toll the war had taken on the people. The regime continued to exert tight control over the population. Political repression persisted, and the Communist Party maintained its monopoly on power. While some reforms were introduced to address the country's economic problems, the centralization of power and control continued to stifle dissent. In this environment, the legacy of North Vietnam's totalitarian rule lived on, even after the war's official end. Today, Vietnam is a rapidly developing nation, known for its economic growth and its increasing role in global affairs. But the country's communist government still holds power, and the scars of the past are not easily erased. The legacy of North Vietnam's regime, the repression, the authoritarianism, and the memories of war continue to shape the nation's political culture and its relationship with the world. While the economy has modernized, issues of human rights and political freedoms remain contentious. The government still restricts freedom of speech and assembly, and those who openly criticize the regime can face severe consequences. The memories of the war and the dark history of North Vietnam's leadership still loom large over the country's political landscape. For the people of Vietnam, particularly those in the north, the legacy of the war is both a source of national pride and a painful reminder of the cost of victory. The suffering of the war years, whether it was the loss of family, the destruction of communities, or the oppressive political atmosphere, shapes the worldview of the generations that came after. The dark history of North Vietnam is one of revolution, resilience, and, ultimately, profound human cost. It is a history marred by political repression, immense loss, and the devastating consequences of war. But it is also a history of a people who, against all odds, fought for their vision of independence and socialism. In the years since, Vietnam has rebuilt, yet the shadow of its past remains. To understand the complex legacy of North Vietnam, we must remember both the sacrifices and the injustices of the past. Only through confronting the darkness of history can we move toward a future shaped by the lessons learned from it. Thank you for watching. If you found this video informative, please like, share, and subscribe for more in-depth looks at history and its impact on our world today.